AI זה חשוב, אבל שמעתם פעם על HI? בחברת הפינטק אינטואיט, שפיתחה פלטפורמה מבוססת AI לניהול תשלומים שמשרתת כבר 100 מיליון לקוחות ברחבי העולם, מאמינים שהעתיד טמון דווקא ב-Human Intelligence, ולכן במרכז הפיתוח שלה בישראל מגייסים את מהנדסי התוכנה וחוקרי הדאטה החדים והחריפים ביותר, שנהנים מסביבת עבודה שמשלבת בין היציבות של חברה גלובלית רווחית לבין החדשנות של סטארט-אפ. אם אתם כאלה בדיוק, חפשו בגוגל אינטואיט ישראל Careers. רשת עושים היסטוריה.
רשת עושים היסטוריה.
רשת עושים היסטוריה. גיטהאב הוא שירות לניהול גרסאות, אבל הוא גם הרבה יותר מזה. כאשר נולד הוא היווה מהפכה, פלטפורמה שהגדירה את עולם הפיתוח כמעט דת. זה קרה ב-2007, ומאז זרמו אינסוף פול ריקווסטס בשרתים שלו. ב-2018 נרכש השירות על-ידי מיקרוסופט בכ$7.5 מיליארד. איך כל זה התחיל? ולאן זה הולך מכאן? צ'אקון הוא אחד המייסדים של גיטהאב. הוא אוונגליסט של גיט, מרצה ומפתח, והיום הוא כבר מרים בעצמו סטארט-אפ חדש, בטלר, גם הוא בתחום ניהול הגרסאות. הגיע לתל-אביב לכנס המפתחים של וויקס, וזאת הייתה הזדמנות נהדרת בשביל עמית בן דור ובשבילי לפגוש אותו לשיחה מרתקת, 2 על 1, על רקע קולות רחוקים של משתתפי הכנס. איך נראו הימים הראשונים בגיטהאב? במה הם טעו כמייסדים ובמה הם היו נאיביים? מה הפך את גיטהאב לשחקנית המובילה בשוק? כיצד ייראה לדעתו העתיד של כתיבת קוד בעזרת בינה מלאכותית? מה תהיה תרומתם של מודלי שפה גדולים לניהול גרסאות בקוד? יש תובנות מעניינות מאוד בכל השאלות הללו, ושווה להקשיב לכולן. אני בועז לוי, ואתם מאזינים ומאזינות לעושים תוכנה. עושים תוכנה.
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. So I want to start with maybe my story with GitHub. When I just started as a programmer in my early days, so I was looking for a piece of code and I found something that I think it was like a backend code, one library. And then GitHub was already like very famous. So I went over there and I was like, okay, this is the code looking good. So, but how do I use it? So I was looking for this button of like download. I really want to use the code. And then like after a few, like a week or something like that, I was struggling to find that. I realized there's a software behind it called Git and the whole philosophy behind that. So that's my story about like Git and GitHub. So it's really interesting for me to hear about like, how did you start with Git, with GitHub? What's the story?
Yeah, so I started, I was had a job in the Valley. This is probably in 2000. I moved there in 2002. I think I was working for this company around 2007 or 2006. And that's around when Git was starting to get written, actually, like so sort of the beginning of Git. And essentially what we were trying to do in my company, we had this sort of advertising system, and we were trying to get assets to all of these machines that were in malls and theaters and stuff. And my friend Nick Hangeveld kind of got interested in this Git project because he realized that we could use that to move assets from one computer to the other. And so we weren't actually using it as a version. We were using Perforce as our version control system. But for content distribution network, we were using Git, right? So we would sort of create these branches on the central server, and then all of the clients would do a pull all the time. And it was kind of nice because if whatever assets it already had, it didn't have to pull again, like the pack file that it would build wouldn't contain them. And so it was just the differences between what it had and what it needed. And it was very good at doing that, right? And so we just used it for that, for just these sort of this sort of content pulling. And so that taught me the internals. I had to learn I didn't learn the porcelain. Like I actually didn't learn checkout and you know, like these commands that you would normally use to do version control. I use the low level stuff of like writing trees and reading trees and, you know, writing out branch pointers and things like that. And so I started by writing some documentation. Like I wrote a bunch of stuff sort of open source, and then I wrote a PDF that was like Git internals, and I was just super into Git. And that was kind of how I met the GitHub guys. So at the time, like everybody was using Subversion. We were all in the Ruby community together in San Francisco. And I went to this Ruby meetup, and I kept talking about Git. Every time that I'd go, everybody could do like little lightning talks, right? And I would do lightning talks every other week about some dumb Git thing that I was just obsessed with it. Like it was so interesting to me. We were all using Subversion. The whole open source world in the Ruby world was all in Subversion at the time. And I started seeing everybody kind of getting more into Git, like maybe we can use this as a version control system. And so Tom and Chris decided that they wanted to do this side project. And I think Tom had it first and kind of recruited Chris into it and said, I want to do this thing that is this really nice hosting platform, just a place to put code, right? Like, because there wasn't that many places. Most people would just run their own server somewhere. And so we're like, they decided, let's do this side project to make this GitHub. And they approached me, I think, relatively early on because they just knew me as the Git guy, right? Mm. And they didn't really know the internals and stuff as well. They were learning it, but like I obviously, you know, that was all I ever talked about. And so that's kind of how I got brought in. And I was trying in the early days, I wrote a gist first. So if you've ever used like the GitHub gist, that was my first project there, and I was kind of contracting for them, and all of it was a side project. Everybody had day jobs. And then I think one day, actually Jeffrey Grosenbach, I think, was the first person to ask, who had this thing called Peep Code, and that's who I published my PDF through. He wanted to pay for private repositories, right? He was like, I love this. It was all public. And he was like, I'd really like to pay you and just put my you know, all of the source code for this.
Take my money.
Yeah, take my money.
And before that, it was only like public, open source.
It was a sort of side project thing. And so I think PJ, who worked with Chris, kind of came in and was like, okay, I'll write this billing system, right? And so he wrote it like over a weekend so we could take Jeff's money. And then it just kind of snowballed. Like everybody in the Ruby community started using it for their side projects. And then relatively early on, the Rails project, because we knew David and we knew sort of the Basecamp people, they decided to move the Rails project to that. And that really is what exploded us, I think, in the early days, because now the whole Ruby community was using us, and that kind of ate into the JavaScript community as well, because it was a lot of the same people, right? And so it was interesting to kind of watch it explode. At first, we were just taking the revenue that was coming in and buying beers, you know, on Friday or whatever, and like going to the pub and drinking beers and talking about like what would be cool next, right? And kind of working on that. And it was still in the sort of side project phase. And at some point, I think the guys were like, this is like, we should do this. Like this should be this is bigger than what we're doing for our real job, right? Or like I think Chris and PJ were consulting and trying to build out this thing called FamSpam at the time. And they were like, this is obviously a bigger hit, right? So maybe we're onto something. And we all quit our jobs around the same time. And at the time, actually, I think I was making a good amount of money at this nice, you know, Valley job. And I left it and made like a third of the money, like working at GitHub, because we just didn't have that much that was coming in at the time. But we kind of did that and sacrificed a bit. And it took probably 6 or 8 months before we had enough revenue to really start paying ourselves anywhere close to what I was making before. And it seemed like risky or stupid decision at the time, right? Like, and obviously it's turned out really well, but it was just that I loved working on this thing. Like GitHub was so much fun to work on. It was so interesting to write developer tools as a developer, as opposed to an advertising network or, you know, like Bitcoin or like stuff that people like work on, because like, actually I know a lot of people that are in like crypto, not because they love crypto, but because they like Rust, right? And it's just like, I just want a Rust job. Like I just want to work in this technology that I love. And we kind of had the best of both worlds, right? Like I got to work on Ruby stuff with people that were really fun in this. None of us had ever really like been managers before or whatever. Like we had this very young, 20-something approach to building a business, but just being able to do whatever we wanted, right?
It was also the idea of no management at all, or even later on.
So, I mean, that's an interesting GitHub story, right? Is because none of us had been managers and none of us really had great experiences with managers. Like we hadn't been in companies that were big enough or mature enough to have good management where you're like, thank goodness that, I have this manager because they really help me do my job well, right? I think none of us had that background. And so none of us could come. I mean, I had managers that I liked, like as people, but like it was always frustrating, right? And so when we started the company, what we looked at as a model for how to build was open source and not corporate sort of structures. And in the open source world, there's no management, right? Like that's not real. There's not a person that's kind of like, there's a maintainer who can say, I'll accept this or I'll not accept this. And if you want to start working on a big project, you should probably ask me beforehand so that you don't waste your time, right? But there's not somebody assigning work, right? Or assigning teams or whatever. Like that's not how open source works. And so we looked at that model and we're like, this is how we like working. Like why not build a commercial, software project with these principles? And that's how it started, right? Like we just kind of rethought it and we're like, let's just throw everything out the window. And we didn't really have a framework for what the advantages of management was. Mm-hmm. And so we were just like, let's not do it. Let's see how far we can get without doing that, right? And it bit us eventually, right? There are reasons that you have managers. There's ways that you can't get big things done without some sort of management structure. It's just very, very hard to coordinate thousands of people or hundreds of people or even dozens of people to do big things if you don't have some way of saying, here's what's important to us as a group and here's what's valuable for you to work on. If everybody's just doing whatever they want to, right, then what you end up having is a problem when you don't know what the company wants, and so you don't know how to be valuable, right? And it's very demoralizing to people, and it's very difficult for people to not have anxiety in their job. It's much easier for most people to say, here's what's important to the company. Let's all figure out how to get that done, and then you can do your best job towards that. But if there's no goal, right, that you can put your best effort into, then it's frustrating, right?
Did you manage somehow, once you get into more like traditional company with goal, strategy, etc., to keep this like somewhat this culture of more open source in a way?
I think so. I think we, for better or for worse, we kept this strategy of trying to rethink things, right? Of questioning everything. We used to use the phrase first principles. We would say, okay, here's what we want to do, and sort of the long game, and we can come up with a way of getting there, but what's more interesting is to break it down and ask a lot of why. Like, what are we really trying to do? Are we just doing this thing because that's how it's been done, or because it's the easy, path given the tools that we have? Or are we questioning it from first principles and saying, what are we really trying to accomplish, and can we break it down to those first principles and then build back up an interesting solution that may not have been done before, right? So you can see this actually, a really early example was the sign-up page, like when you sign up for an account, because it's very easy to look at other things in the space and kind of copy them because you assume that it's sort of best practices, right? And not question the motivation or the reasoning behind them. And so like we would look at, a good example was the sign-up page where if you look at SourceForge, right, which was kind of similar at the time, they had 10 questions, right? What's your first name? What's your last name? What's your email address? Give us your email address a second time to make sure you didn't make a mistake. What's your password? Like, where did you hear about us? Like, click all these boxes. And it's this huge thing. And we're like, what's the minimum that we can get away with? And because this doesn't provide value to the user. This you have all those fields because it provides value to for marketing or for whatever, but we're like, we don't care. Let's make it as good as possible for the user. Can we just have an email address and that's it, right? Like you just type it in and now you have an account. Then you can do your password later or whatever. Like what is the best possible thing for the user in that circumstance for what they're trying to accomplish, which is to create an account so that they can save their work, right? Or they can create new projects or something. And we can ask for shit when we need it. If you question everything all the time, it's very difficult, but you can come up with some great ideas, right? And you can also, just to be fair, you can also be naive about it and not have the sort of industry experience that maybe there's a reason that it's that way, right? Maybe there's a reason that management is this way. Maybe it solves problems.
Do you remember any mistakes that you've made this way doing these kind of decisions?
Yeah, I think that the no management, the way that we approached it was naive, and caused probably more problems than it solved. I think what I've done in startups that I've done after this, so I've done 2 startups after this, and you want to make it so that people have autonomy and can be creative and can provide ideas, right, or can work on what's exciting to them. So you don't want to be like micromanaging or something, but I think you do want to have a reporting structure. Like, you need to know who do I report to. You need to have, I mean, it's debatable if you need to have one-on-ones or something, but you need to know, if I have a problem, who do I talk to about it? And it's one person. It's not whatever co-founder I know best, right? Or something like that, which is kind of what happened at GitHub. And it needs to be clear that if I'm questioning, am I doing a good job? Like, if you have imposter syndrome or something, like, who do I ask, am I doing a good job? Or who do I get feedback that I am doing a good job, that the company does value what I'm doing? And if not, that they can redirect me and say, instead of that, work on this, that's going to be more valuable for us and for you, right? And they give them confidence that they're doing a good job.
אנחנו אמנם אומת הסטארט-אפ, אבל בואו נדבר על המציאות. גם ההייטק הישראלי נמצא בסוג של מלחמה. חברות נסגרות, אנשים מפוטרים, וכולם מרגישים את הלחץ. אבל בתוך כל התקופה הקשה הזו, יש לי חדשות טובות. הייטק זון, מועדון ההטבות של עובדי ההייטק, שמביא איתו 16 שנים של ניסיון ולמעלה מ-430,000 חברים פעילים, פותח את הדלת גם לחברות הקטנות. אתם יודעים, אלה שתמיד הסתכלו מהצד על ההטבות שהיו שמורות רק לגדולים. בהייטק זון אפשר למצוא את כמעט כל הגיפט קארדים המוזלים, חופשות במחירי עלות, מכשירי חשמל, ביטוחים אטרקטיביים ואפילו קייטנות מוזלות לילדים. כל מה שיכול לעזור לכם להתמודד עם יוקר המחיה. כעת גם סטארט-אפים וחברות קטנות מוזמנים להצטרף וליהנות מכל מה שיש למועדון להציע. חברות עד 15 עובדים זוכות לשנה ראשונה בחינם, ואלו שקצת יותר גדולות יקבלו 20% הנחה עם קוד הקופון עושים 20 או SIM 20 בהרשמה דרך הבאנר באתר הבית של רשת עושים היסטוריה. הייטק זון, נהנים כמו הגדולים גם אם אתם קטנים.
So coming back to the story of GitHub, so you were talking about that the Ruby community came in and then everything started to grow. So what happened after that?
Yeah, I mean, it was very slow. So, I mean, we were getting, a couple of signups a day, more and more subscriptions, and it would kind of be more and more and more. And it was very interesting to watch. It's great when it gets to the point where you don't care about them anymore, right? Where there's just some room where the subscriptions are coming in and it's just old news at some point. But it was a question, we were bootstrapping, and it wasn't actually, it was kind of an interesting story. Like, we talked about raising money in the early days, and we talked to investors, right? And I remember very specifically one of the investors said that our total market cap for what we were doing, they kind of based it off of SourceForge and sort of these open source forges that were around that did advertising, and they're like, the total market cap is $100 million for this entire industry, right? Uh-huh. And so we could have raised money from people, and we debated it and decided it wasn't worth it because we could take some money, we can hire some people, we can, do this a little bit faster. And we decided not to. And so we bootstrapped the company, which meant we had to wait until our revenue got high enough that we could hire another person. And it was like the four of us, like I said, it was 6 months before we were making salaries that we had come close to making before. And then it was another maybe 6 months before we were making enough revenue we could hire like another developer.
Mm-hmm. And that was because you thought it's going to get much, much bigger and that's not a good point to raise, or just like...
No, I think we didn't know that it was gonna get huge, right? Like I think we were afraid that it would plateau or that, we would hit the end of the Ruby community and no other community would be interested, or maybe Mercurial would kind of end up winning out, or, we didn't really, nothing was really set in stone at that point. And very few other communities were using Git. Like, it hadn't won the war. I mean, at the time there was Canonical, had Bazaar, right? And there was like Darks, and there was Arch, and there were all these distributed version control systems where this was this new kind of idea to have it, that for version control systems to be distributed at all. And there were 5 of them.
What do you think made the difference, actually, GitHub, to become what it was?
It depends. I think there were 2 things. I think one was Linux, and very specifically Android, because Android became a big thing, which meant that all of these big companies had to start using Git because it was the easiest way to contribute patches back to the Linux core, which filtered down into Android or to Android, the Android project itself. So Google had just acquired Android and had just decided that they were going to make a mobile operating system off of it. And so Google moved to Git. My first thing that I did, I think, when I started at GitHub was that I was like, a friend of mine that worked at Google, Sean, he was like, we're moving to Git. We're trying to train everybody in Google, in the Android sort of group, how to use Git, because we were using Perforce or something. My first thing that I did when I started at GitHub was I went to the Google campus and I did Git training, and they invoiced GitHub. So like one of the first big and I ended up doing these training things for Git, for Motorola, for Qualcomm, right? Like for these large sort of mobile company, like mobile focused companies, because all of them were moving to Android. And so that made them all move to Git because Linux was on Git. So that was part of it. I think that was part of it from the top level. I think GitHub also had a big role to play. Like I think the popularity of GitHub, because I think there was a lot of, like, Facebook was still on, I think is still on Mercurial. Like there were some companies that really liked Mercurial and really wanted, like Mercurial is much better in lots of ways, right? Like it had a great plugin system. It was easy to add stuff to it. It was in Python. It wasn't in C, right? Like it was easy to extend. And Git had essentially no plugin system, no reentrant library. There was no way to build anything around it that wasn't around fork execing calls, right, to this POSIX binary. Like it was a much weirder sort of environment to build tool chains around. So I don't think anybody was confident that would happen. I think GitHub helped because, you know, people, like, there was no GitHub equivalent for Mercurial until Bitbucket, which came several years later and was never quite as big. And so that's just, we ended up being the community. And so people would learn Git even if they hated it, because that's where the community is. And so I think the community of GitHub really helped Git win the sort of distributed version control war in a way that it otherwise may not have, right? And it's hard to tell. And I'm also biased because I'm GitHub, right? And I went around and I tried to evangelize Git. I spent so much time in my first years just going and giving conference talks and just saying, have you guys heard of Git? Like, here's how cool this is, right? So maybe it was partially me. Like I really don't, or maybe it was Linus, right? Like maybe people were just like, well, we know Linux and we know Linus, and like he wrote this thing, and so it must be cool, and so we'll put more effort into that.
ליינוס, שעליו אנחנו מדברים בחזוף פמיליאריות, הוא ליינוס טורבלדס, המפתח הפיני המיתולוגי שהגה והוביל את בנייתה של לינוקס. כמה שנים אחר כך, בתחילת שנות ה-2000, יצר גם את גיט, מערכת ניהול גרסאות מבוססת קוד פתוח שעומדת ביסודה של גיטהאב. היום חי ליינוס בארצות הברית.
How did you come to know Linus personally, you mean?
I've actually never met Linus. We've been, I think, at the same conference one time, and I've always wanted to kind of get a beer with him. I think he has never liked GitHub, just as a thing. Like he kind of, he doesn't like Ruby. He doesn't like GitHub. But it was funny because there was this big, some breach on like kernel.org or something, and so where he would keep his Linux tree, his main tree, or one of his tree mirrors, and so it was down for like weeks, like and all of the open source projects that were there, there was some breach, and so they were afraid that somebody would like inject something malicious into one of the trees, and so he started a mirror on GitHub, and because we were the best Git host around. And I remember he gave an interview like in 2011 or something where he was like, I don't like GitHub. I hate pull requests. I don't like what they've done to sort of the collaboration model, but they are a solid Git host, right? And so he has a tree there, and it just has this big thing on it that's like, do not open a pull request on this because I will immediately close them. I think he even wrote a bot that just automatically closes everything. Like he hated it. And then I just heard a story, actually. I think his daughter is, or very recently was, interning at GitHub.
Wow.
And so I think, I have not verified this, but I heard a story that his daughter was interning at GitHub, and she was working on some project, and he finally gave in and opened a pull request. Like it's like his first pull request was like very recently, where he was like, okay, this isn't the worst thing in the world. Like it is a little bit easier for people to do than, you know, formatting patches on a mailing list.
Yeah, sometimes family is a good
or, you know, you just get old and you know, I mean, I feel like I'm old at this point, but you know, whatever's easiest, right? Like gets the job done. What I found really, really interesting is trying to think about what software development was like before GitHub, because what GitHub really did, or what it ended up doing, was making it so that the workflow for open source and the workflow for corporate development was essentially the same thing, right? That it was Git based, it was pull request based, it was having conversations on stuff, it was merging things in, it was using the same tool. Like it didn't matter if you were doing open source stuff or if you were doing your corporate project. It was all on GitHub. Just one was private and one was not, right? That's literally the only difference. And it worked to our advantage because a lot of people were using GitHub for public stuff, for open source. Mm-hmm. And we would kind of use that as marketing, because people would put URLs in every conference talk in an open source, every open source conference talk in the last 15 years has had a GitHub URL in it somewhere. Like everybody marketed for us, which was fantastic. But then the other thing was that the open source workflows trained people on how to do software development and be able to bring it into their corporate environment, which made us money, right? And so, but they were pre-trained. Like they didn't have to start this. It wasn't like starting with Perforce and being like, okay, let's figure out how to use Perforce. Like everybody knew how to use GitHub. And so when they said, let's just use this internally and have a private instance or have GitHub Enterprise or something, everybody was like, well, there's no training necessary. We all know how to use this, right? It was really it was accidentally genius. Like none of us thought about it this way, but like now it's made it so that there's this homogeny in the workflows of every software developer, right? Like it doesn't matter if it's open source or corporate or internal, whatever. So I left GitHub and I did another startup, which was a language learning startup, and that has worked okay, but not really well enough. And so I moved on, and my partner and I decided that we wanted to do another startup, and I really wanted to look at, actually, we were investing in all of these different companies. So like post GitHub acquisition, like I started some investing in companies, and we invested in this one company that was a version control system. They were trying to do a brand new version control system, and they had really rethought the idea of version control. And the premise was kind of, how come you can do like if you're working on a document in Google Docs and you're working on a document in your source code project or something, they're very, very different models, right? Because they both have version control, but they do it very differently. So Google Docs saves everything, all that you don't commit in Google Docs, right? But you have every save, right?
Just happened.
And so it's just automatically does it, and it automatically kind of creates these snapshots. And so you have kind of the same thing, and you can share it, right? You can collaborate on it. It's just a very different model, right? It's real time, but it's much easier. You just take a URL, you send it to somebody, you tell them what permissions they can have, and it's done, right? Like you don't have to create a project and push it and, add them as a collaborator and send a pull request, whatever, right? Like it's a very different model. And it was so interesting to me to think we're collaborating and saving documents, but there's two entirely different models. And it made me think about just sort of how, like, again, like first principles, like going back to what are we really trying to accomplish? Is there a way to have a better GitHub client, right? Because the GitHub desktop is a client, but it's essentially a wrapper on Git. It does more or less the same thing, right? But can you completely rethink this, but end up with a GitHub artifact, right? Like a branch on GitHub, but like you can do it locally in a completely different, it doesn't really matter, right? Like as long as the push is some Git commit, then how you create that tree or how you create that Git commit can be anything. Just reimagine, like how do you think about this? So that's what we started doing and what we started building. And I find it really interesting to think about this. I mean, we can go through a bunch of Git commands, but like Git I mean, there's ones that are overloaded, like checkout or whatever, right? That does multiple things that are very orthogonal to each other. But the interesting one is commit. Like if you think about git commit, it really does three very different things, right? Like it does one thing, which is create a commit, but we use it for three very different types of things. So we use it to save our work, right? So you'll do a commit that's like a work in progress because you want to switch branches or something, or you're just like, you just don't want to lose your work because otherwise Git doesn't save anything. It's not Google Docs, right? It's not recording things all the time. You have to commit something in order to have it save any data. And so you use it to do work in progress. So if you've ever done work in progress commits, that's not you're not committing to that, right? You're just saying save. It's like git save, right?
And
like
then
you
get those funny commit messages of like, I'm saving that.
Yeah,
or
I mean, this is
something
the
like
thing. Like that, like funny commit messages or work in progress commits never happen in the Linux kernel because it's for, they use it for documenting changes that they want to describe and to get accepted, right? And so you use it to document your changes, right? So that a blame comes up with relevant information or people can understand why they're going to merge this in or what these changes are supposed to do. Use it to document, use it to save, and then you also use it to share. So you have to commit something in order to push it to somebody else. One of the things we're trying to build is to break these out into separate things, right? Like have something that watches your working directory and just saves everything all the time so you don't have to do work in progress commits because you have all your data saved without a commit, that we can synchronize changes in your working directory without having to do a commit so that other people can look at them and there's a URL for them and you can review them beforehand. And then have a way of using commit just to document changes, right? So that you're saying, here's why I did it this way and here's why I did it this way. And it'd even be nice to not have to do that at the very end of the process for you.
I feel like the user experience of a developer is something that was not challenged enough by companies, by open source, so like in this specific area. So it's really, really interesting to see where it's going to go.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Just go to Indeed.com/PODKATZ12 right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
So on another topic, and we have to speak about that, and that's the whole generative AI revolution. So one personal question, I know that you're still writing a lot of code, and do you use Gen AI to as assistant to write code? Or?
I do. I use it embarrassingly a lot because AI to me in the programming sphere at least is massively valuable as documentation, right? As a partial replacement for looking up documentation or finding examples, right? Because it can give you examples. They don't always work, but they almost always point you in the right direction. I started doing Rust work, so I had to kind of learn Rust because I wanted to do the Git stuff, and I did prototypes in Ruby with Rugged using libgit2. But there's a libgit2 binding in Rust as well, and so I'd kind of prototype it in Ruby, and then because I could get it done and make sure that I could even get it to work, and then implement it in Rust. And so learning Rust, I'm not a systems programmer. I have done minimal work in C or C++.
Low level.
Yeah.
Languages.
And so I haven't thought about the stack and the heap for 20 years, since I was in college, really, right? And so all of a sudden I have to do, borrowing and sort of memory management and stuff that you have to do in order to write Rust stuff. And generative AI tools are the best. If you're learning a new language, or even if it's didn't have to be Ruby to Rust, right? It could be Ruby to Python or something where it's I basically know how to do it, but it is different, right? And I know logically what I want to do, but I have to look up examples, right? Or read a book or whatever. But what is nice is if you're a relatively good programmer and you know what you want to do and you know what should kind of work, and then I'll just write a comment and then Copilot will finish it and 80% of the time it gets me close, right? And I can fix it or something. And it's so fascinating to me that I'm like, I don't even have to look up documentation half the time. Or it'll tell me calls that I didn't even know existed. And then I'll go look up those calls in the documentation and be like, oh, I didn't know that call existed. Like that's actually, now I can, it didn't do it right, but like it told me what to look at in order to do it right. And I find it so much more valuable, or just it's such a huge time saver over having to look up API documentation, right? Like it's really fascinating. I'm a huge fan of it. I use it all the time. It would be almost impossible for me to do Rust programming without it right now, just because, I mean, it just would take twice as long.
And I also think like when you go to a new language, sometimes you don't really know the best practices, the design patterns, etc. So that's...
Yeah, actually, I'm curious about that. My assumption would be that generative AI tools would be really good at that, because it would be sort of the statistical, average of how people program. So I'm not sure, like it might be best practices in that it's what's practiced most. I don't know if it'd be best
average practice.
Yeah, the average practice. But like that's probably better than bad practices, right? So, but yeah.
And one more visionary question. So when you're looking at version control and also on the open source world, how do you see those might change with like generative AI and the way that people are programming today?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, if we talk about first principles again, right, with open source, like why do people do open source? Like what is the value of open source, right? And I find open source incredibly valuable, but people have different value sets that they bring to it. Like, are they doing it because they want code to be free, right? Or they have like sort of coding, like a software religious argument. There should never be any closed source. Everything should always be open, right? This sort of Stallman sort of approach to things. Or is it like, I have a much more, I think, practical approach, which is I think open source is good because now not everybody's reinventing the wheel, right? Like anything you're doing in a corporate context should be open if it's not specific to your company, right? If it's a generic solution to some answer. Like the GitHub was a great example of this. GitHub was not open source itself, but we had hundreds of libraries that were open source. Tons of stuff that people use all the time were open sourced from. I'm surprised actually, now that I'm building another company that's in this space, how many times I come to something that is like an industry standard and it came out of GitHub, right? And you took off into its own thing. What I think is difficult about open source is how hard it is to do that, because if you want to open source a project, you have to create a project, you have to maintain the project. You can't really, like if for example, I do this like the OpenAI stuff, right? If I get a snippet and it doesn't quite work and then I make it work, I can't share that, right? It'd be nice to like even hit a button and be like, make this snippet open source. Like this is a solution. It's like a recipe. Like I'd like open source to not necessarily have to be a library or project base, but to be able to come down to a snippet level, right? And say, like, here's solving problems in a language that are very specific, and let's have billions of them somewhere, and then let maybe an AI system help find them for us, right? Like when we're looking for that particular problem, because that is not what open source, like open source, all of those things that OpenAI does, they're trained on open source. Like I think it's trained on all this GitHub data, but it has to extract from other projects like individual solutions to stuff, as opposed to being, it would be nice to just have gists like in mass, right? Where it's just in my editor, I can be like, yep, I want to share this so that, because I struggled with it, I fucking finally figured it out. Sorry, can I swear on that? I think I've limited it to 2 swear words so far, but I want to be cognizant. But I think bringing down the barrier to contribution, bringing down the friction involved in open sourcing stuff. This is what GitHub really did for the open source community, but it has only done it at a project level. Like it'd be nice for that to be at a snippet level or at a file level, right? And just be like, just here's something that solves a thing, and I worked on it, and I don't want anybody to have to work on this again, right?
So basically you're proposing an AI which will be like open source, or something like that?
I think just a database, like more of it's not, here's all, like, here, I go to GitHub, I don't know, let's come up with a name for like opensource3.0.com /s Chacon. It has all my snippets. Like, I don't think that's particularly valuable. Like GitHub has kind of been nice as almost a CV for people, right? Of like, here's all the projects I work on. But like, it'd be nice to just have this thing that I can send code to and just contribute to the community almost anonymously, right? Or maybe if other people use my snippets, I get some karma or whatever points, or like Scott's contributing a lot of things that are found valuable by a larger community, right? Like it can be more abstract, I think. But what's interesting about generative like LLM tools is that it makes a database like that usable, right? Like if you had to go to a website and find like nobody would really use that. But if you're using Copilot or you're using, ChatGPT or something to help you solve programming problems, and it has access to a database of all these things that are, there's some training, like it's trained specifically to look for and find the right snippets and be able to bring them in and be like, this is a verified sort of solution. It's not me just coming up with it. We use some vector database or whatever to find like good candidates and say, here's some good candidates, right? But like these are verified solutions. I think the future of open source is making it smaller.
Maybe last question about the future of like coding and, this generation today. You talked about the generation that is just no Git today. So maybe this generation today that knows coding only with Copilot or some LLM. So how do you see like the future in like a few years from now, how coding will look like?
So I don't know. What I assume, just kind of extrapolating from what I see now, is that I think AI has a interesting role that will be played. And I think what's interesting about it, and people get mad about it, is that it comes up with bullshit, right? Like it comes up with stuff that doesn't work, and because it has no real sort of intelligence behind it, it's just, here's statistically something that seems like it could be right? Mm-hmm. Or it looks right generally. And from a code perspective, that's problematic because it won't know that it's wrong, right? Unless it can test it. But the interesting thing about it is because it's statistical, because it's non-deterministic, you can say, give me 1,000 of them, right? And make sure that they're all different. And here's a test, run all of them through that test, and then give me the 3 that pass that test, right? And I think I'm not seeing this yet as a tool, but I think that this is obviously kind of where we're going, right? Where we're heading is being able to describe a problem. Like actually it'd be interesting to be able to open a pull request that has no code, that just has the description of what you want the pull request to eventually be able to do, and then have an LLM look at it, or maybe even have some tests, or write some tests. You can verify that this is how I want the tests to run, and then generate 1,000 solutions, and then like open sort of a couple of pseudo pull requests that pass the test and seem to do what you want it to do, right? And then you can take one and then iterate, right? And be like, okay, this is the closest, but do this and this and this, right? And then it does 1,000 of those and then comes back with 3 that give you, and then just kind of iterate on it. So I think coding or writing code, right, can be more describing what you want and verifying what happens, right?
And making choices.
And not necessarily have to type everything out, every line of code all the time. I think that the text editor as we know it today will become a very different tool when we have this computing power, right? And these LLMs that can do lots and lots of, it can't do more. It can just generate stuff in parallel. Like it's interesting to think about coding, because coding it doesn't have one solution, right? It never has one solution. There's 1,000 people in this room over here that are software developers. If you give all of them the exact same task, you're going to get 1,000 different solutions to it, right? And depending on how specific you are, they'll be more divergent. And so it's not about there's one way to solve something, right? You can write stuff that doesn't compile or doesn't work, obviously, but like you can get different interpretations of the same thing. And so I think a lot of it is going to be about taste, right? About product, about what do we really want to build in a way that solves the problem of how I want it to be solved. And I think it's not about writing the code. Like, I don't even think it's ever been really about writing the code. It's about, like, I write relatively bad code, I think, right? Like, it's not, but I know what I want it to do. And I think I have good taste in what I want the product to be, right? And so for me, like, I'm seeing this, actually right now, there's this big thing on, like, Rails and stuff, and Rails doesn't scale, blah, blah, blah. But like, what's interesting about it is that it doesn't really matter, right? Like, what matters is, do you build something that people want to use? It doesn't matter if you start using Scala or, like some proper, like the right scalable language to build something crappy. Like, nobody cares, right? but you can use a less scalable language that you like working in to build something that people love and figure it out, right? Like, and so I feel like LLMs are that, like it can write bad code, it can write, it can be improved later, but what matters, I think, is what do you want to build, right? And it's about that iterative process of having taste and figuring out what are you producing that is the right thing to make for people, that solves real problems and solves it in the right way, rather than, I'm doing it in Vim, right? And like writing it properly, and I'm a real programmer. Like I've always thought that was kind of stupid. And LLMs just make that less important.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a risk in this direction that we're going into innovation when you want to write something which LLM never seen before, so people won't be able to do things like that anymore?
I think it's almost going to go the other direction. What we haven't seen yet, because the LLMs that can write code haven't been around long enough, is languages and frameworks that are built specifically for what LLMs are good at, right? So we've kind of seen the opposite. Like we write languages and frameworks based on what human beings are bad at, and what human beings are good at. So we have typed languages and things like that, where we want to move when we find problems to a place that's easier for us to manage, but it's really built around humans and around the weaknesses and strengths of humans. But what we don't have is a language, or specifically a language like a framework that you can build something interesting in that's good at what LLMs are good at, right? It's good at having a structure where you can generate 1,000 and test them very easily and figure out, is the output exactly what you're going for? Like, we don't have those. And so at some point, I think it's inevitable that we'll build something like a framework that is very hard for a human being to write anything valuable in, but it's very easy for an LLM to write something interesting in and for us to be able to validate. And so I think when we get to that stage, then it'll be interesting, because then it'll be hard to build things in those frameworks that you don't use an LLM for, because it's not built for you to do it very easily. And I'm fascinated what that might look like, right? Like what and how you might build stuff off of that. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about sort of generative user interfaces, right? Where you go to a website or you're trying to solve something, it's not always the same user interface. It knows you, it knows what you're trying to do, it has some context, and it generates a user interface based on what it thinks you're trying to solve, right? Based on what it knows about you and your state and what what the purpose of the website is. But it'll make debugging incredibly difficult, right? Because everybody has a different user interface, but it could make user experience very fascinating of its guessing. Like right now, that's kind of what the chat interface is, right? Everybody gets a slightly different, the user interface is just chat, but the what you're trying to solve and how you're trying to solve it is different for every single user, right? So if it does something wrong, it's hard to debug. But like, what if it was, producing buttons and doing windows and trying to give you data in a way that it thinks is valuable based on the data it has and who you are, right? And so I think everything will start becoming more non-deterministic in a way that presents new challenges and is at the same time very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah. Can I do a plug for I've already talked about Butler a little bit, but like,
of course,
I have this new startup. We're really small, but we're in this sort of alpha phase, and we're looking for people to help us test stuff out, right? So if you're interested in this, in a new Git client and giving us feedback and telling us what breaks and things like that, you can go to gitbutler.com and sign up for the alpha, or just go to our Discord channel and ping me and ask me for an invite, and I'll send you an invite. You can start using it. We're even giving source code access or nightlies and stuff to people who really want to like find it interesting, want to dig in, or if you're a really good Rust developer that is willing to move to Berlin or lives in Berlin, we want to hire people that are good at this. But that's just my plugs for. I want to try to get some people that are interested in this that can give us some good feedback.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It was fascinating. Really, a lot of food for thought about this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
הרבה דברים אפשר לקחת מהשיחה הזאת עם סקוט, אבל הדבר המשמעותי ביותר הוא כנראה ההבחנה שלו בעניין כתיבת תוכנה. מה שחשוב באמת זאת לא השפה שבה משתמשים, לא הסקלביליות הפוטנציאלית, ובעצם לא שום דבר טכני במהותו. לא חייבים אפילו להיות מתכנתים מצטיינים. סקוט בעצמו הודע שהוא אינו כזה. מה שהכי חשוב מעל הכל הוא האהבה. שהיוזרים יאהבו את מה שאתם עושים, שיהיה לזה מקום בעולם. שם הכל מתחיל ונגמר. עד כאן הפרק הזה של עושים תוכנה. אני בועז לוי, תודה לצוות רשת עושים היסטוריה, להילה שמש, עורכת התוכנית, לדני תימור המנהל העסקי, לשלי נוי, מנהלת ההפקה, לאביב שם טוב, סמנכ"ל התפעול, ולעמית חזזי מצוות המחירות. בצוות התוכנית גם שלי גואטה וזלטה צ'בן. מוזמנים לעקוב אחרי הפודקאסט עושים תוכנה בכל אפליקציות הפודקאסטים שבסמארטפון שלכם, ולהצטרף לקבוצת הפייסבוק שלנו עושים תוכנה, שם נעדכן על פרקים חדשים ונדבר על תוכנה. להתראות בפרק הבא.
לפודקאסטים נוספים של רשת עושים היסטוריה ולהצטרפות לרשימת התפוצה של התוכנית בדואר האלקטרוני, בקרו ב-עושימhistoria.com או הורידו את אפליקציית עושים היסטוריה בחנות האפליקציות של אנדרואיד.